Claire, thank you for taking the time to speak with me today. Can you start by telling me what is the Bank of England's Out and Proud Charter and why was it created?
Yeah, of course, no problem. So the Bank of England's Out and Proud Charter was launched last year, 2019, July 2019. And it's a charter which contains 5 principles that we commit to as an organisation to promote and further LGBT plus inclusion. So the reason that we did this was so that we could formalise our commitment to show the UK and the industry that this is our stance, and these are the principles and standards that we will hold ourselves against. And the reason that we published it externally is really so that we can hold ourselves accountable, others can do the same, and so that we could really start a conversation on LGBT plus inclusion in the financial sector.
And it's great that that dialogue is taking place. Can you tell me about the Charter's 5 principles?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you say, the 5 principles that make up the document altogether, they're not in a particular order, but they're all equally as important. So the first one that we have is that we support LGBT plus inclusion at the highest level in our organisation. So what that means for us is that we have an executive sponsor of our LGBT plus network. So somebody who's very senior in the organisation who helps us to drive forward change, and is really there to kind of champion our initiatives and be our voice, I suppose, in senior governance forums. And also that people who are senior in the Bank of England will visibly support initiatives to do with LGBT plus inclusion and engage with our work as well. The second one that we have is that we empower and we regularly consult our LGBT plus network. I think that's pretty self-explanatory, but really it's just setting in stone that we, the LGBT plus network, are very highly valued in the organisation, and that we kind of our views are listened to for how we drive change in this space. And that we also have a remit and scope to work with our people and culture team who focus on inclusion and to work with HR on initiatives that affect LGBT plus inclusion. The third one is that we take a zero tolerance approach to any type of bullying and harassment, including LGBT plus bullying and harassment. So that, again, that's pretty self-explanatory, but it's just formalising that is our view. The fourth one is that we promote awareness of LGBT plus issues and initiatives in the workplace. So we continue to talk about it. We give our staff opportunities to learn about LGBT plus issues, and we mark important calendar events throughout the year. And the last one is that we capture and we use meaningful data. So we explain to ourselves clearly why we want data related to sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and how we're going to use that to promote LGBT plus inclusion in the Bank of England. And one of the ways that we use data as well is that we always do our Stonewall Workplace Equality Index submission. And we really value the feedback that we get, and we use it to drive change for the next year, and to think about how we can always self-improve in this space. So they're the 5 principles that make it up at a high level.
Thank you. And the principles sound very powerful. Can you tell me about how the Bank of England will put the Charter into practice?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's something that we thought very carefully about. So we knew when it was introduced last year in 2019 that the Charter was really the first step, and that we would also have to kind of follow it up with a concrete plan for how we will deliver it as well, and kind of uphold these principles and everything that we do. So that's why when our executive sponsor, Sarah Breeden, launched the Charter, she also gave a commitment to producing a corresponding action plan. So that's something that we've worked on as an organisation ever since. So the action plan has concrete actions, it has owners for each action within it, it has deadlines for when we hope to achieve these things. And we also made the point that it was endorsed by our court of directors, which is, I suppose, the equivalent to a board in a private company. So we'll check kind of our progress and what we've achieved on a monthly basis against our action plan to make sure that we're delivering against the Charter. And then we'll also go through a bit more of like a formal process on a biannual basis to see if there's anything that we need to change for our action plan based on staff feedback or changes in society, or just sort of we've made a lot of progress and we need to set ourselves new ambitions. So the action plan is really how we kind of live, breathe, drive those principles in our LGBT inclusion at the bank.
Thank you. And I understand that the charter and the accompanying action plan were both endorsed by the senior staff, including the governor of the Bank of England. How did you get that support, and what's the importance of this?
I guess the first thing to say is that the Bank of England cares very deeply about diversity and inclusion. So there's already a lot of senior support internally for LGBT plus inclusion, and a lot of receptiveness to new ideas in this space and new ways that we can drive it forward. So that's the first thing to say. In this case, the LGBT plus employee network, together with our executive sponsor and with our people and culture team, created the charter and then the corresponding action plan, and then decided to kind of make use of our internal governance framework that we have to take it to a number of governance forums and ask for endorsement of this work. So the highest governance forum that we have in the bank is the Court of Directors. So that's ultimately where we took both of these documents to and asked them for their endorsement of that and to engage with this work. I think so. We did it for three reasons really. The first is that the action plan and the charter are owned by the Bank of England. This is our strategy, and this impacts the entire organisation. So we really need buy-in and support from everybody across the bank at all different levels, including the very top of the bank, the governor, the chair of court, to drive this forward. We need commitment from everybody. So that was the first reason. The second is that by having the endorsement, it really gave us like a mandate to deliver this work. So now we have the kind of ability to say to people that this is our action plan, which has been endorsed by our court. This is what we're trying to achieve, and this is our deadline to do that. And it's very clear why we're asking of certain changes and movements internally. And the last reason really is to give it visibility. So by taking it to the top governance forum, the court, all of our senior staff are aware of the Out and Proud Charter. They're all aware of the LGBT plus action plan. And of course, a lot of internal comms follow to other staff as well. So I would say that most people across the organisation have engaged with this work in some way. They're very clear on our aims and what we're trying to achieve. So I think it was really important to have this kind of senior visibility and support, and it will be a key part of driving it forward.
Can you tell me a bit about what impact the Charter and Action Plan have had at the Bank of England so far?
The Charter has been in place now for about 18 months, and the Action Plan is a bit more recent. So it came out, I think it was October this year. But the first thing to say is that we've had an LGBT plus employee network for a number of years. And before we brought in the Charter and the Action Plan, we had our People and Culture department, which focused on inclusion. So we were doing a lot in the LGBT plus inclusion space. We had a lot of events, a lot of initiatives, a lot of ways to engage. But I think what the biggest impact the Charter and the Action Plan have had so far is that it forced us to take a step back and strategize, and do a bit of like a gap analysis almost about what are we really good at as an organisation for LGBT plus inclusion. What are things that we could do better? Where do we have gaps which we need to address? So it really forced us to think about that and kind of centralised our approach. And that's been great because it's really clear to everybody now exactly what we're trying to achieve and when by. And that kind of helps us to move a bit quicker because it's clear in all of our minds. And I think the other impact it's had is that it's made it very clear for senior people at the bank how they can engage with LGBT plus inclusion. So there's always been a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of support, but perhaps not so clear how to show that support. And the action plan, the internal version that we have, has very clear ways that they can do that, whether it's by, educating themselves and writing a blog on our internal site, or by marking an important calendar event. I think that it's, they're the two biggest impacts so far. But of course, over the course of the next 12 months, as we implement these actions, I expect there'll be more impact to come, a lot of impact to come.
Thank you. And speaking of important calendar events, it was recently Trans Awareness Week. What did the Bank of England do to mark this occasion?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so Trans Awareness Week is in November. It ended with Trans Day of Remembrance, and like every organisation, I suppose, in the UK, we had the challenge of delivering it virtually this year. But there was a number of ways that we marked Trans Awareness Week, and I think it was a real success and a lot of enthusiasm this year, despite the fact that it was virtual, and perhaps even more so because it was virtual. So we did a few different things. First of all, we had an informal staff discussion. We call it trans inclusivity, like cup of tea, which you can feel free to use in your own organisation. It applies in a lot of different ways. So the staff could drop in and just have a bit of an informal chat about trans inclusion, what they can do to be a good ally, ask questions. Why do we include pronouns in our email signatures? How should we do that? So that was a really successful session. The other thing that we had was a trans webinar. So it was run by an external organisation who kind of educated us a bit more on the background to Trans Awareness Week and Trans Day of Remembrance, and also gave us some hints about how we could be better trans allies and different educational materials that we could read. And we also had a lot of blogs. So we have an internal intranet site, and a lot of different staff posted their personal experiences, or that, how they spoke to family members about trans inclusion. And that was really encouraging to see. It was a lot of enthusiasm. But I think perhaps the best thing that we did this year was that we lit up our Bank of England Threadneedle Street building in the colours of the trans flag. So that was a really obviously visible sign of our support for this community. And the pictures were shared on Twitter, LinkedIn, on the Monday of Trans Awareness Week. So yes, a lot of enthusiasm this year, and I think it was a really successful Trans Awareness Week for us.
That's great, and it's brilliant to hear about the actions that the Bank of England are taking. But what actions can CFA UK members take within their own workplaces to be more inclusive of LGBT plus individuals?
So I think there's a number of core actions that any workplace can take to promote LGBT plus inclusion. So the first thing that I would say is make sure that you have an LGBT plus network and that you have an executive sponsor for that. So somebody who's very senior in your organization that will help you to champion this cause. And think about how you want to structure your network. So do you want it to be people that have a certain role? Do you want to have a trans rep? Do you want to have a bi rep? Do you want to have somebody who leads on events? So think about what works for your organization. But I would say that your LGBT network will be key to kind of helping to drive change. The second thing that I would say is make sure that when you do events and initiatives for LGBT plus inclusion, that you represent the whole spectrum. So think about not just marking, for example, Pride, and thinking about LGBT plus inclusion in the summer, but also how do you mark Bi Visibility Day? How do you mark Trans Awareness Week? So think about including everybody when you set a strategy. The next thing that I would say is intersectionality. Think about the intersectionality between the LGBT plus community and race, gender, people of faith. It's something that we start to think about a lot more as an organisation, and it will be a big thing for us as we move into 2021. We have a lot of staff networks internally, and how can we collaborate with them so that if people belong to more than one community, and it's a strong part of their identity that they're in both, how do we best represent those individuals and make sure that they feel included? And finally, I would say think about adopting our charter. So think about the Bank of England Charter, whether it works for your organisation. And if you do adopt it, what actions would you need to take to kind of live it and put it into place? Do you need to create your own action plan to uphold the principles? Or if you don't feel that the Bank of England Charter is directly applicable to your organisation for whatever reason, think about creating your own. Think about creating your own charter, putting it on your website, and just formalising your commitment to LGBT plus inclusion.
And you mentioned 2021, and next year we'll see the introduction of Alan Turing on the £50 banknote. What else do you think the banking industry needs to do to become more inclusive of LGBT plus individuals?
I think that the Turing note will be really symbolic for the LGBT plus community. And we'll hear a lot more about it next year and a lot of excitement. So that's a really good moment. In terms of what else the banking sector could do, I think the first thing is recognise that diversity is beneficial to your organisation. So if you have a diverse range of employees, you're going to have diversity of thought, and it's going to lead to better decision making, better outcomes for your organisation. So that's the first thing I'd say. Diversity is something to cherish, and recognise that within your own organisation. So the second thing is think about whether you are an inclusive place to work for people who are LGBT plus, and also whether you can retain those brilliant people who are LGBT and work for your organisation. So I think this applies in two ways. So thinking about your recruitment process, is it inclusive from start to finish? So from the moment that you post the job advertisement to the moment that you make somebody an offer, have you thought about inclusion and how that fits in the process? And I would say the second thing is, how do you retain people? And I think that comes down to culture. Is your organization somewhere where LGBT plus individuals feel comfortable, safe, and that they can thrive and progress in their careers, and feel kind of proud about their personality, rather than it being any kind of barrier to succeeding in the banking sector? And then I would say as well, for the banking sector, of course, you will also have clients and customers who you represent. So think about those individuals, not just your employees, but who do you represent, who do you serve, and do you give those LGBT plus individuals the best experience possible? Or are there things that you could change to make the experience that you give them even better and even more inclusive? And then finally, I would say just to keep talking. I think that talking about LGBT plus inclusion is the best thing, because we can all learn from each other in this space. And of course, how the Bank of England's put out this Out and Proud Charter, and it's led to us having this conversation today. There are also firms in the banking sector who are doing brilliant things, and they're really good at LGBT plus inclusion, and we can learn a lot from them as well. So I think just continuing the conversation is the way that we can lift ourselves up as an entire sector.
Claire, thank you so much for talking to me today on the Bank of England's Out of Pound Charter.
No problem.